This is a story that tells of the rebellion of Africans against their centuries-long enslavement in the Americas and the ripples and consequences of both the enslavement and the rebellions, even today, even in Baltimore. We must start with the understanding of the structure of the transatlantic slave trade, or trade that had three parts or three legs. On the first leg, European ships sailed to West Africa and sold things like iron, brandy, guns, and gunpowder. They sold them for Africans who were enslaved. The second leg, or middle passage, saw enslaved Africans being shipped to both North and South America and everywhere in between. More than 12 million people were sold in this way. And in the third leg of this triangle, things grown by the enslaved, products like molasses, cotton, and a blue dye called indigo, were shipped to Europe, completing the triangle. Startlingly, 95% of those who were captured and enslaved on the shores of Africa were shipped in the Middle Passage to the Caribbean and to South America. 95%. Look at the tiny lines going to North America, representing the relative few who were shipped there. Consequently, what happened with enslaved Africans south of Florida, outside of the United States, was of more significance than anything in the United States. From the point of view of the enslaved, we need to have what is called a Pan-African perspective, looking at the enslaved Africans in every colony in the Americas and their ancestors on the mother continent together. And from the point of view of the European and American enslavers, we might be interested to know that prior to the Civil War, there were those with Confederate sympathies who not only wished to secede from the United States, but wanted to establish a slave empire from the southern U.S. that extended all the way into South America, with the Caribbean as its physical center. And no less a person than Ta-Nehisi Coates has reminded us that some people in Baltimore envisioned it as the financial center of this slave empire, much as New York eventually became the financial center of the United States. Of the millions of Africans carried across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage, a not insignificant number of them were already leaders among their own people, kings and queens and generals who had lost wars and therefore been captured and sold by their enemies. They brought with them their intelligence, their spiritual and physical courage, and of course their experience to resist and lead rebellions against the new inhumane conditions in which they found themselves. And they passed these character traits down to their children. In this story, we will meet some of them. For instance, in Brazil, fugitive slaves called Maroons established one community called a Quilombo on a high plateau about 60 miles in from the coast. It was called Palmeiras. Beginning with about 40 Maroons in 1605, Palmeiras, the biggest Brazilian Quilombo, grew to a collection of communities numbering 30,000 almost 100 years later. These communities individually and as a whole had farms, fortifications, and a sophisticated political and military organization based on African models that repeatedly and successfully repelled both the Dutch and Portuguese armies sent against them. Palmeiras represented a multicultural society, a direct challenge to the European class and race-based structures of the plantations. The communities were not all black. They included runaway Portuguese soldiers, people of mixed race, and even some indigenous people. Because of their isolation, they were forced to raid nearby plantations to get supplies otherwise not available to them, and to liberate and recruit new people for their besieged Quilombos. Most newcomers to Palmeiras were eager participants seeking refuge, but if the raiders encountered reluctant slaves on nearby plantations, the slaves retained their status, even in Palmeiras. Palmeiras' last leader was a descendant of Congo royalty named Zumbi. He had been born free in 1650, was enslaved at 6, and given to a Portuguese priest who taught him Latin and Portuguese. He had even served as an altar boy in a Catholic church. But at 15 he escaped and became a master of the Angolan martial arts form known as capoeira. As he matured, his physical prowess, cunning mind, and sharp mistrust of the Portuguese led to his becoming the leader of Palmares in 1679. Zumbi's queen was Dandara, who besides birthing their 3 children, fought beside her husband against the enslavers. She, like her husband, was also an expert in capoeira. After nearly 100 years of defending Palmares from both Dutch and Portuguese armies, and after Zumbi defeated 6 attacks between 1680 and 1686, the Portuguese sent 2 highly skilled and experienced generals with an army of mercenaries and indigenous people in 1694. After a 23-day siege, Palmares finally fell. With this tragic defeat, Dandara, along with 200 other residents of Palmares, committed suicide rather than submit to re-enslavement. Zumbi escaped, but he was captured and beheaded a year later in 1695. Zumbi and Dandara were not the first, or the only, or the last African leaders of resistance against enslavement in the Americas. The story of Zumbi and Palmares' resistance to slavery and oppression lives on today more than 300 years later. November 20th, the day of his execution, is celebrated as Black Awareness Day in Brazil, and a recent progressive president has ordered that every Brazilian child learn Afro-Brazilian history. The spirit of African resistance to enslavement certainly lived on 100 years later in the successful and permanent rebellion of the enslaved that occurred in Saint-Dominique, now known as Haiti, between 1791 and 1804. It is much closer to us in time and distance, and it sent shock waves throughout the slaveholding Atlantic world, including Maryland. Out of 12 million Africans brought through the Middle Passage in 300 years, only 650,000 were brought to North America, just 5%. And of those, only 128,000 landed in the Middle Atlantic region that includes Maryland. By contrast, in the late 1700s, an average of 30,000 Africans were brought to Haiti alone every year. Conditions were so harsh and life was so short that there was relatively little successful reproduction among the enslaved, only work and death, and the dead needed to be replaced. Far more than enslaved blacks born in North America, every generation of black Haitians was directly linked to the cultural and spiritual heritage of Africa. Haiti occupies the west end of the island of Hispaniola. The other half is the Dominican Republic. Haiti was always France's richest colony. Haiti's slave economy produced 40% of Europe's sugar and 60% of Europe's coffee, plus indigo and cotton. Haiti had a 4- or 5-tiered social structure with some peculiar characteristics. At the top were what were called the Grands Blancs, or Great Whites. These were the landowners who were richer than the planters in the United States, such as Washington and Jefferson. They were fabulously wealthy because of the success of the sugar plantations. They lived in huge mansions, attended by slaves, and decorated their homes with the finest furniture and art from Europe. And they always chafed at the taxes and regulations put on them by the French government, whether it was the monarchy, the Revolutionary General Assembly, or later by Napoleon. Under them were the Petit Blancs, the small whites, who were small businessmen or artisans. They always wanted to identify with and enjoy the same race privileges as the Grand Blanc. Under them were a combination of free blacks and mixed-race peoples. Unlike the restrictions of the one-drop rule in the United States, where 1 drop of black blood thrust you in the racial divide onto the side of the blacks, many mixed-race children of the Grand Blancs were freed and often enjoyed status and wealth. Some of the mixed race, like some of the free blacks, owned slaves themselves. They most often identified up and not down toward the enslaved. At the bottom of the pyramid, and comprising almost 90% of the population, were the enslaved, the people who were literally worked to death to create all the wealth for the whites at the top. As can easily be imagined, these for the most part were not the Haitians who ended up in Baltimore after the Revolution. The Haitian Revolution, which began with a slave revolt in 1791 and progressed to encompass many free blacks and people of mixed race over 12 years, took place in a time of revolutions. The U.S. had just had a revolution, which very pointedly did not include freedom for its black population. France was in the midst of its revolution, and despite the revolutionary proclamation of the rights of man, only hesitantly and intermittently embraced the idea of freedom for the enslaved in the colonies. And the Haitian Revolution took place in the context of international rivalry between France and Spain and England. It was a long, complicated, and exhausting revolution over 12 years, with shifting alliances and heartbreaking casualties and destruction. Its outcome was stunning, but the details of its progress are too convoluted to recount here. The Haitian Revolution formally started in August of 1791, when the most trusted slaves on a number of plantations near Haiti's largest city, Cape Français, set fire to the plantations in a coordinated attack. The collective rebellion was almost sabotaged when one of the conspirators jumped the gun and started a fire a day early. He was captured and interrogated and spilled the beans about the plot. But the plantation owners found it incredible that the supposedly ignorant slaves would be smart enough or organized enough to pull off such an attack. The enslaved were underestimated. The revolution was long, complicated, and brutal. Many of the Grand Blancs fled as soon as it started, leaving their money-making plantations in the care of trustees. At various times, French soldiers were sent to put down the rebellion, with little ultimate success. At first, the enslaved thought that the king wanted them free. Then they identified with the pronouncements of the supposedly enlightened French revolutionaries, who for a time did officially free the slaves. Then Napoleon came to power and wanted to reimpose slavery, trying to buy off the free black leadership. Finally, in desperation, Napoleon sent Rochambeau, son of the French general who had aided Washington in the American Revolution, to put down the Haitian Revolution by any means necessary. He used especially cruel tactics to terrorize the revolutionaries. In addition to legions of French soldiers, he brought 1,500 man-eating dogs and buried people alive in pits with large flesh-eating insects. His cruelties managed to unite some of the competing factions among the rebels. In the end, he was defeated, and it was Rochambeau himself who was forced to surrender to the final leader of the rebels, General Jean-Jacques Dessalines, in 1803 at Cape Français, where the revolution had begun 12 years earlier. The leader who had pulled together the revolutionaries into a coherent national fighting force was the extremely skilled general Toussaint Louverture. An example of African excellence, he was the grandson of the King of Alada in West Africa, currently Benin, and the son of a general whose whole family had been captured and enslaved and dragged across the Atlantic. Seeing his obvious intelligence as a child, his enlightened master allowed him to learn to read and write, and Toussaint eventually absorbed the French European Enlightenment political philosophers and developed a deep devotion to Catholicism. The revolution was already underway when it kind of swept him up, but his demonstrated ability to lead soldiers finally resulted in his being in command of the whole Haitian army. General Dessalines became his confidant and lieutenant. Toussaint drafted a constitution that recognized everyone, for the first time in the Americas, for the first time in the whole world, everyone as free. However, before the revolution could be completed, he was tricked by French forces, captured, and sent to France, and ended up dying in a dungeon in the French Alps. After the death of Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines was the leader when the French were finally defeated in 1803. But these two men led the only successful and permanent slave rebellion in the Western Hemisphere. And in the end, Dessalines was as brutal with the French as the French had been with his people. 800 wounded soldiers left behind by their officers were drowned, and eventually every French man, woman, and child was slaughtered at his orders. Not every white person. In fact, Polish allies were made honorary blacks. But he could risk no chance that the French, who even treacherously killed the more trusting Toussaint Louverture, would reverse what the Haitians had accomplished. His fears were justified by later developments. These two men's actions and the movement they led struck fear in the hearts of every slaveholder, even in Maryland, and the fear was that these revolts would spread. The Haitian Revolution was an historic rupture in the history of the American world. It not only challenged national politics, it challenged the world of white assumptions about blacks. Listen to the white supremacy behind these comments. Marcus Rainsford, a British officer who visited Haiti in 1799, expressed astonishment at a horde of Negroes emancipating themselves from the vilest slavery and at once filling the relations of society, enacting laws and commanding armies in the colonies of Europe. And Conde Raggart, an American visiting Haiti in 1804, wrote about the civility which one meets with from the peasantry in traveling, and which ran counter to his assumptions of black backwardness. In towns he found men with a degree of politeness and urbanity of manners scarcely conceivable. The Haitian Revolution began with the enslaved's bid for freedom, which it achieved, but ended with the creation of an independent state. Haiti was the first nation in the world to be made up entirely of freed peoples. Haiti was the first nation where a successful revolution of blacks had prevailed over Europeans in the Western world. Haiti's revolution blocked Napoleon's plans for a colonial empire in North America. It was altogether a stunning accomplishment. When the successful Haitian Revolution forced Napoleon to give up his dreams of colonization in the New World, his sale of French territories that we know as Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the U.S. and assured that the U.S. would become a continental nation. Some of the consequences of the Haitian Revolution and the Louisiana Purchase were these. A. It created the United States' first refugee crisis as thousands of Haitians flocked to New Orleans, Charleston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. B. It gave opportunity for the Trail of Tears as it allowed the federal government a place to which they could remove the Native Americans into what became Oklahoma or the so-called Indian Territory and make room for the growth of more plantations in the South. C. The growth in cotton and sugarcane plantations in the South created the demand for slaves that sucked 1.2 million enslaved people out of the Middle Atlantic regions in the Second Middle Passage and sent them into the Deep South. All this is the result of what happened on a little island in the Caribbean. Approximately 1,000 white and 500 black refugees landed in Baltimore during the Haitian Revolution. No matter what part of Haitian society they came from, all Haitians of any color or status brought with them the story of the slave rebellion and intensified a white fear of blacks. In the great debate about abolition taking place in the U.S., emancipation became equated in many minds with economic ruin and the massacre of whites. The example of Haiti was used as a weapon against abolition, and the Maryland General Assembly in 1793 passed a law limiting the number of slaves that could be imported from the French Caribbean. Nevertheless, the black Haitians arriving in Baltimore, who were Catholics, were welcomed by the white French Sulpician fathers, who themselves had just come to Baltimore as refugees from the French Revolution. Together, they founded churches and schools that still exist today. One insufficiently appreciated person in this history is Mother Mary Lang. She was born in Cuba of Haitian parents in a Haitian community and had an excellent education. In 1813, she found her way to Baltimore because of its French Caribbean community. She was a devout Catholic and in 1829, with Sulpician support, she, together with 3 Haitian women, founded the Oblate Sisters of Providence, who started a school for African American girls, which eventually became the St. Francis Academy on Eager Street in East Baltimore. When the city of Baltimore was not providing any education to black children, this was of immense importance. Most people in Baltimore have never heard of Mother Mary Lang, but she is being considered for beatification by the Catholic Church and may become the first African American female saint. These are young Catholic women in a Catholic school. St. Francis long ago became coeducational, and these are some of today's students. Notice the marker behind them with a picture of Mother Mary Lang. Another long-lasting legacy of Haitian immigrants in Baltimore is St. Francis Xavier Church, the first parish established for black Catholics in the U.S. When the first Haitians arrived here, the Sulpician Fathers, who established and ran St. Mary's Seminary, arranged for the black Catholics to worship in the basement of the seminary. The congregation grew and needed larger quarters. The building pictured here was purchased in 1864 as the first black parish in the U.S. It was located at Calvert and Pleasant Streets, just down at the bottom of the hill behind what is now Mercy Hospital. One of the priests who served this congregation described the hundreds of feet who, even in freezing, icy weather, nevertheless braved a trip down a 60-degree angled hill to get to early Mass before heading off to work. The parishioners were coming from the African American community in front of Mercy Hospital on St. Paul Street, the African American community that was destroyed by the city in 1917 to build what is now Preston Gardens. The congregation moved its location several times, but it arrived at its present site on East Oliver Street in East Baltimore in 1968. The first black Catholic priest ever ordained in the U.S., Father Charles Ralph Uncles, came from St. Francis Xavier, as have other leaders in the city. Most of the Haitians arriving in Baltimore were from the middle classes of Haitian society and did not favor the revolution. But the stories of a successful slave rebellion rippled through the black population as well, enslaved and free. And Nat Turner's rebellion in the neighboring state of Virginia in 1831, where 60 whites were killed, certainly intensified the fear among many whites that if it could happen there, it could happen here. Hundreds of blacks across 3 states were killed by whites in retaliation. The hardening of fear of blacks, combined with a growing abolitionist movement in the U.S., drove white people across a broad political spectrum to converge on the idea that blacks, if not enslaved, had to be removed from American society, that they could and should be sent back to Africa. The American colonization movement was born, and Baltimore became its center. And here is a footnote to the story of Haiti, an outrage, a continuing theft that justified General Dessalines' total mistrust of the French. A Forbes magazine article from 2017 describes it this way. In 1825, barely 2 decades after winning its independence against all odds, Haiti was forced to begin paying enormous reparations to the French slaveholders it had overthrown. Those payments would have been a staggering burden for any fledgling nation, but Haiti wasn't just any fledgling nation. It was a republic formed and led by blacks who had risen up against the institution of slavery. As such, Haiti's independence was viewed as a threat by all slave-owning countries, the United States included, and its very existence rankled racist sensibilities globally. Thus Haiti, tiny, impoverished, and all alone in a hostile world, had little choice but to accede to France's reparations demands, which were delivered to Port-au-Prince by a fleet of heavily armed warships in 1825. So a tiny black nation had to pay reparations to one of Europe's richest and most powerful countries, a wealthy European power in no small part because of the work of the enslaved in Haiti. In other words, Haiti paid France for the privilege of its people no longer having to be slaves. and because it didn't have the funds, it had to borrow the money from French banks and then pay interest to those banks for the loans. It took 122 years until 1947 to pay off this debt. These huge reparations set the stage for Haiti's impoverishment today and France's national wealth. Many churches and non-governmental organizations from white Western countries like to make charitable visits to Haiti to build schools and offer relief to Haiti's impoverished population. This is not unwelcome, but perhaps a better plan would be for France to return its stolen wealth that it got when it robbed Haiti at the point of naval cannons. This is a chart which we will visit at the end of this and every subsequent presentation. It vividly illustrates the magnitude of the challenges we face today in unraveling white supremacy and institutional racism. For 86% of the more than 400 years that African Americans have been on these shores, they have had to live with violent, terrorist, legal, and extra-legal oppression in order that wealth could be squeezed from them. In fact, the foundational wealth of the whole U.S. Republic rests mostly on their backs. And all of us are somewhere on this timeline.